Okay, so the non-probability sampling. The most common form of this is something called convenience sampling, and this is simply the group that you have access to. So probably when you completed your master's degree, you may have conducted a project within your class, or maybe if you're a high school teacher, multiple classes that you may see. That's a convenience sample. It's who you have access to. They're a captive audience, but they don't necessarily represent your school or your district because students aren't really randomly assigned to anything. Not everybody has an equal chance of participating. Now, that being said, that's okay. As long it's okay to have a convenience sample. Any of these types of sampling are okay as long as you're upfront about what they are and don't try to make a claim about something that's not true. The old joke is that we know more about college sophomores and lab rats in universities than we do anything else, and that's because in psychology programs, we actually have those are two groups that we have pretty easy access to. College sophomores need the money to, or they used to, I guess traditionally, so they'll participate in research studies for the psychology program, and lab rats, obviously, well, they're not going anywhere. So how many do you need for a convenience sample? Or actually this applies to any of these non-probabilities. Well, for qualitative researchers, what they're looking for is to seek saturation. It's not how many is the issue, it's do you understand the phenomenon. So going back to our experiment we did the other day in class where we had these focus groups, you wouldn't necessarily need to have a certain number of people participate that. That's kind of irrelevant. What you want to know is, do we really understand the issue? Have we asked enough people the question that we're starting to get the same answer over and over? And really, that's what we mean by saturation is when you are starting asking another group questions and you're hearing the exact same thing you've already heard, you're probably there. That's different than quantitative researchers who seek statistical validity, because what we want to do with a hypothesis is we want it to be able to generalize from our sample to the population. You can't do that in qualitative research. And therefore, we have to have a large enough, varied enough, diverse enough sample to say our group looks like the population we're talking about. We don't need all of them. We can't afford to do all of them. We just need to have a really good sample. And you want to make sure that you have not systematically excluded anyone from participating. Because the main thing about this is trying to establish external validity. And basically what external validity is an explanation of how you might be wrong in making a generalization. For example, if you were to conclude the results of your study, which was completed in a specific place with certain types of people at a specific time, can be generalized to another context. And what we mean by that is another place with different people at a different time. Those are the major threats to external validity, because there's three ways that you could be wrong. It may be that the people are different, the place is different, or the time is different. And this is the real struggle with making generalizations, and why we have to be so sure about our hypothesis. It's because we can be wrong about these things. And you have to do a good enough job of selecting the people that you could try to say, it doesn't really matter how many more times you do this, because our sample looks like our population so well that it can't possibly be different. But you're still going to run into these other issues of, well, if you did this somewhere else, yes, this might be true of a school district in North Central Texas, and they have a good sample, but does that necessarily mean it's true of a school district in the Metroplex, which is a different place? We have to recognize that. Or it may be true right now, but does that mean that it's always going to hold true? Is this going to hold true the next time we do this? So another example of this, of non-probability sampling, is purposive sampling. And this is a process, this is more like a case study kind of research process by which the researchers select a sample based on experience or knowledge of the group to be sampled. So let's say hypothetically you're interested in studying the effects of alcoholism on immediate family. But you're going to go out and you're going to try that your population is the families, the immediate families, the spouse and the children of alcoholics. That's going to take a very purposive group. And you're going to go to places where you can access that. So for example, there's a organization called Al-Anon, which is a support group for people who are members of the family of alcoholics. And when I've talked to people about doing this and asked the question, is that good enough? Generally people say yes. Well, that's not necessarily true, because just because a person participates in Al-Anon, that does not necessarily mean that that is a representative sample. So you've got to do one of two things. Is either your purposive sample has to include people, families of alcoholic who don't participate in Al-Anon, and we know that there's some that probably don't. Or when you explain in your research what your results are, you have to explain to the audience, this is only true of family participants of Al-Anon, support groups of Al-Anon, immediate family of Al-Anon. This is not necessarily true of that. And that's perfectly fine to do that. You just got to be upfront about that process. Quota sampling. You don't see this a lot anymore. There used to be a time, and people have gotten away from doing this, where you would go out to, for the mall, for example, and there's a researcher standing there asking people questions. And they're gathering data from those people based upon certain quotas. So odds are nobody's ever really paid attention to this, but what happens is if you were to watch that person, eventually they would stop letting certain groups go. So for example, going in, and this is, how would I put this? It might sound a little bit sexist, but if you were to say, if you're in a mall and a person's asking people questions, and they ask the women a lot of questions up front, eventually they're going to stop asking women questions and only start asking the men, because they have a quota that they're trying to fulfill on that. I'm not saying that there's more women that go to malls, but hypothetically there may be, because of the stores that are in there. Now, that being said, malls are not probably the best place to go get that kind of information anymore. So for example, let's take Walmart's. If we're doing this kind of quota sampling at Walmart's, it may be that we're looking for families, so people coming in with families. It may be that they're looking for women, and they're going to ask them questions about their status because they're trying to come up with a certain quota to represent their population. This is still non-probability sampling, because not everybody has an equal chance to participate in this. A theoretical sample is more closely tied to qualitative research. It's when you have a general research question and you develop a population based upon what that research question is. And when you take qualitative research, one of the things that you'll learn about that is you don't really have a specific hypothesis with that. Your hypothesis develops from that. So therefore, in the same respect, you're going to develop this theoretical sample based upon what that idea is. You collect relevant data, interpret that data, then develop a conceptual framework from that. And you will then start to tighten up your specific question and collect more data and write up the findings. So your sample is really built based upon what you think your hypothesis is, based upon some general questions that you have. So obviously the challenge with this is there is not a good way to be able to make any kind of generalization from that. What you're trying to do in this program, or certainly in our final objective, is you do want to be able to generalize this. You want to be able to say, we think that what we did had this effect, good or bad. And that sample has to be done well enough that we can make a pretty good generalization from that. So the Proviso non-probability sampling is there is no generalization. And that means that because your sample in non-probability sampling is limited only to a very specific group, we can't talk about anything other than that specific group. That is the downside of non-probability sampling. We don't want that happening with what we're trying to do. We do want to be able to try to use probability sampling as much as we possibly can. Again, either way that you do this, though, as long as you're upfront about that and you don't try to say something that's true that's not, we tend to be okay. There's an example that I use in a master's level class about a research study that was published about computer-aided programs in first grade classes and the effects that have. If you were just to read the results would indicate that computer-aided teaching helps first grade students in their reading. If you go back and you look at the sample they use, their sample is one class in an elementary school in the Northeast United States, and that class is comprised of all white children. Yet their results indicate that this program made a difference. This was published research. It was published in a journal article. It's also published in a research book, not because it was shown as a problem. It's just an example of a study. When I started reading that, I noticed that they had this issue with their sample and nobody ever caught it. So that is your job to catch all that. So there's a couple of slides on here that I'm not going to go over. We're not going to worry about this. So there's an example that I'm going to put on D2L of some sampling exercises that I want you and your groups to work through. And we'll take about a week or so to work through those because you're also in the middle of trying to do your midterm exam.